Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Yash Sabharwal, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on streamlined tech transfer, making the impossible easy with a sound approach and methodology. We have provided full bios for our speakers in the registration materials, and will plan to circulate a shareable link to a recording of this webinar with all of you once it becomes available. So I'm going to kick things off today with a short presentation on the topic of tech transfer. So there was a white paper that came out last year by the McKinsey folks, and in that paper they talked a little bit about the stages of tech transfer and how they believe that streamlining tech transfer was going to be important for all the activities related to COVID-19. And in their paper, they talked a little bit about what the stages are, and they quoted a number of statistics. And what was interesting was that the average timeframes for tech transfer range from 24 to 30 months as you think about all these different stages that take place for a well-executed tech transfer. And they were challenging the industry to think about how to shorten these timeframes given the need for a rapid response around the COVID vaccine. So they also quoted a number of statistics around the cost. If you think about the number of FTEs per department for a tech transfer, the number of departments, number of sites per candidate, and then what the total number of FTEs were needed per candidate. They sort of gave estimates around low and high costs around a tech transfer that could range anywhere from approximately 40 million to 400 million. And so clearly, it's a very expensive proposition to manage tech transfer and to execute it for, especially for a vaccine candidate where you have to make doses in very high volumes. So the question is there anything that we can do, about this going forward? And a number of the discussions these days range around the challenges of document-centric systems, how new approaches are needed, especially around structured data frameworks. And the idea being that instead of having a lot of information, buried in documents, are there ways to break up this information into, more atomic data where you have information really in nodes characterized by their buckets. These data nodes can then be linked together. And then you end up creating really a structured data set, a multidimensional data set where every critical piece of information is a node, and it can be linked to other pieces of information, creating a fully addressable data set. And so the focus of the conversation today is going to be around, can we move from tech transfer to tech sharing, essentially, moving away from this approach of transferring large amounts of documents and using that as the primary mechanism of information transfer, and moving more to a digital approach where information can be shared digitally, and that way make the entire process of tech transfer more efficient. So I'd like to, at this point, introduce you to our panelists today. Joining us today are Joschka Buyel, who's with Buyel Pharmaceuticals, and Paul Denny-Gouldson is a principal consultant at Zifo R&D Solutions. So I'm going to start with a series of questions for both the panelists today. Good morning, Paul. Good morning, Joschka.
Morning.
Morning, Yash.
How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Good. It's afternoon here, though.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Same here.
So Joschka, we'll start with you today. We live in an age where technologies are constantly being deployed to make various, operations more efficient. So, why does tech transfer take so long, as sort of described in that McKinsey article?
Yeah, I think it has several reasons. One being the lack of standardization of processes, but also of sites, right, where you actually manufacture. And in the end, only these differences in the sites should matter, right? So that's what you want to focus on, and not of the processes that you want to run in these sites. So another big thing being the acceptance of new technologies, of course, to get better at what you're doing. Right. And let me give you an example. So let's say ascending side defines a parameter XYZ in a way that allows room for interpretation, right? So this will of course cause a lot of noise on the receiving side and then initiate, in the worst case, a back and forth of questions for clarification of details. And of course, we all know that from tech transfers, the details are the ones that really matter in the end, so that everything goes the way it's intended. So there's also inter and intra-company differences in the way things are called or defined, and these differences definitely exist. And currently, we don't have something like an industry standard, and many companies are striving now for an internal standard to overcome this issue. And yeah, of course, a central solution can help you to introduce and maintain a standard, at least within your company and maybe the companies you're working with, right? And then having a solution to store and maintain the standard or harmonize data that you generate can of course aid the tech transfer. These tools may exist already, but then the next big thing is then to get to people to use it and move away from the old way of reporting in Excel and other tools, as you explained on your first slides.
Yeah, so your point around creating a standard taxonomy is an interesting one. Paul, what has been your experience as you think about, as you've been working, in the deployment of IT systems? What are companies doing these days to sort of create more standardized taxonomies around these types of information?
Yeah, a good point. I think we've seen for many years, we've been in an industry that's described master data management and talked about master data management, and a lot of people try master data management, but they do it, historically at a level that isn't detailed enough and down within the domain. So you have a master data management system for your projects and your registered IDs and certain things that sit at the corporate level. But what we've seen over the last 10 years is people spend a lot more time, and now they're kind of reinventing those what used to be called catalogs that sit within IT systems that describe the data, that describe the results and the variables and all these things, to being actually pulling those back out to be master data and embracing not just taxonomy, but ontologies and an ontological description of the environment that they're working in. Because when you project forward in terms of what do you want to know, what do you want to understand, and can you allow a computer to understand that data, you don't just need a taxonomy, right? You need the ontological description and how these things are related. And it goes back to your slide that you put, Yash, right, of the evolution of the paper, electronic systems, then into documents, then actually extracting those assets. But then you had in there, right, your hypergraph or your enterprise graph and your analytics. So to consume that data like that, what we've seen is people spend an awful lot of time now building those ontologies, looking for help externally, because as an industry problem, it's not, an ontology or a taxonomy is not really a competitive element. So there's this definite push towards these standardized ontologies, and then how do you, the problem then comes, how do I map my current systems into that and make it work and make the data work? But that's a kind of different question. But a lot more time is being spent on looking at the data structure and tagging of that data properly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the things that we think about as we have been developing some of our solutions is that there needs to be some sort of reconciliation with the terminology and the regulatory requirements as defined in ICH, right? So, from our perspective, it started to make sense to start there, because ultimately, when it comes time to do a regulatory submission, you want to be speaking in the same sort of language, if you will, that you're going to be communicating with the regulators, around this information. So it is interesting that we haven't seen until recently, a lot done with all the terminology that's in these guidelines. And so, you have a lot of different phrases for different things that ultimately should be, consolidated into a single set of terminologies. Thank you. I think that was, interesting dialogue. Continuing with you, Paul, in that McKinsey white paper that I referenced, there was a quote in there that said, "Tech transfer is as much a craft as a science," which was, to me, quite interesting. Do you agree? And does it have to remain this way?
Yeah, so I'll answer it. It can't stay this way, right? It can't, because we're under pressure to do things better, and my instant kind of picture in my mind of a craft, when someone says it's a craft, you see an artisan, you see this person in their workshop where they've been chiseling away at a piece of wood for many years, and then they've made this very elegant and beautiful wooden model of something, or that's an artisan, that's a craft, right? And where we really need to get to is away from all of those people with, looking at these things and working in their own little way and making very bespoke, unique. Everyone's a different thing. They're not uniform. They're not consistent. You can't do that. And really what we've got to get to is, the 3D printing version of that. So there's the other thing of me saying, well, how can I make this thing? Well, if I can 3D print it, or I can get, automation, robotic control, computerized, delivery of that, precision delivery, then, I think we move even further from science. And I don't even think it's a science, right? This is a process that we have to go through, and we have to deliver the information, in the right way, so that other people within the organization can leverage that and reduce all of that inefficiency. And so for me, the science comes further down, right? Well, how can I make my antibody, and can I change the aggregation parameters, or can I, remove any of the histochemistry or anything? That's the science. But this stuff is for me, it's pure process, and if you industrialize it, then you can remove that, 10 months, and you can make it very, very much shorter. But to do that is not easy. I'm not saying that it's an easy thing to do, but that's where I kind of see that element. And yeah, we've got to change, right? We have to change.
So Joschka, you just went through, I think, and you watched some of your colleagues go through, the process of having to move quickly through some tech transfer activities. With respect to this statement of tech transfer being as much a craft as a science, what were some of the challenges that you encountered trying to get people to be more systematic in their processes around tech transfer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for us, it was the first time to use a new system, so to aid tech transfer and move away from Excel spreadsheets and single reports and so on. So I think this was the biggest challenge, to get people to actually use that system, right? And also, train enough people to maintain the information or gather the information first. So that was also difficult at the beginning, right? If you start with a new solution, of course, there's also always the question like who to train and how many people and who should get access and so on. So this is, of course, all things that you need to think of ahead. But after you have initiated basically the process and it starts to work, people get more interested. And for me, the biggest challenge was get people on board, right? Especially for manufacturing, with a lot of time pressure on certain people to get their buy-in and support in the right moment. So that's for me the difficult part. Yeah.
What were some of the, as people started to recognize some of the efficiencies that came with structuring the information more carefully, and in a more consistent way, what were some of the efficiencies you started to see, come into play?
Yeah, so the reporting, of course, right? So once you have it, then it's there, and you can get updates every day if you want, right? And let's say we have different authors, like one working on a list of materials that are going to be used, and the other one is just using this list of materials for another report, right? And normally in the world of Excel, they have to align all the time, right? Going back and forth, like, oh, what did you change, right? Now I have to copy it again. And now all coming out of a central solution, you don't have that issue anymore. So you're being a little bit more independent of the author, I would say. So that's for me a big plus. And another thing is also like who has changed something, right? So let's say person A changed a material, right? And person B doesn't know that, right? Because he hasn't checked with SAP again or something, right? Then it's also good if you have something like a track change function that helps you so that you can directly see who has changed what, when, and so on. So these were big pluses for us in that regard, yeah.
Yeah, the whole audit trail history and
audit trail history, correct.
Data integrity and so forth really starts to come to the forefront in these types of scenarios. So how did the pandemic exacerbate the challenges of tech transfer? More so than a traditional, tech transfer with prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, so I think there were different aspects to that. So there was a shortage in equipment, disposables worldwide, that of course impacted procurement for us and for all the companies that were doing tech transfers at that time. And then there were also many uncertainties that were usually handled in face-to-face meetings that now had to be managed in Teams and Skype. And this being the new normal, of course, was also a big challenge for us. So it was more difficult to catch the right set of people, because usually in tech transfers, you have teams that have to talk to each other from various departments to align. And with using Teams, Skype, Zoom, and so on all the time, now it was more difficult to get all the people at the same time, catching all the people in the meetings. And so especially at the beginning, we had a lot of meetings coming up because people had to schedule meetings with everyone. And that was, of course, decreasing our efficiency. And we had to come up with a new way of getting away from these traditional face-to-face meetings very quickly, so that we can maintain the efficiency of the tech transfer, not even prolong it, right? So
I would imagine that, one of the things that we were also seeing was that because of the speed at which organizations were moving, especially around the development of the vaccines and the manufacturing, you weren't able to work through your more traditional approach where you sort of finish a process at a particular scale or site, and then you begin that transfer. It was, a lot of scenarios, the smaller scale or the other site process was still being developed as you were trying to transfer to the next scale or site. Can you talk a little bit about if you had any experience with that, and the additional level of complexity that brings to the scenario where the site the sending site hasn't actually finished their process as they're transferring it to the receiving site?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, we can say that for the pandemic, the smaller companies were delivering the drugs, right? And the larger companies were manufacturing. And that, of course, was one of the problems, right? So that smaller companies with limited resources for transfer had to transfer their processes, even unfinished processes, to larger companies. And that, of course, was a big challenge that we tried to resolve with like digging deep into documents ourselves to try to extract as much as possible, because the communication was just limited, right? And everyone has just 24 hours every day, so you have to come up with something that works for you. But this is definitely a challenge that we faced. Yeah.
So Paul, I mean, I imagine you saw some of these challenges as well. You sort of have this moving target, you know, and then on top of that, you have the additional limitations of not being able to fly somewhere and get in a room with people and really hash things out. You know, what were some of the lessons around that? And maybe you could talk a little bit about where you see digital technologies really being impactful for that going forward to resolve those kind of challenges.
Yeah, so interestingly, there was a benefit of the pandemic, unfortunately, which was the scientists weren't in the labs and they weren't in the plant, and they weren't, so much time wasn't being spent there. And we found that we had more access to them to work on these sorts of initiatives and looking at some of these change problems and looking at kind of keeping up or catching up with all of the background work that they had to do. So because most of them had restricted lab exposure, even if they were in the lab and having to do lab work, then they weren't all in the lab all at the same time. So you found this, there was kind of like a time benefit of this where people could spend the time. And so that was one thing that we saw when we were working through that. And it's still like that, you know, not everybody's back, and not everybody's back all the time in the lab. The other thing that we saw, and this was an interesting learning, was that the way people would think about these things had changed in their mind. It wasn't a, do I have to do I have to use this system? Why can't I just do this? I've always done it like this, you know, the Excel. Because there was a natural imperative to go faster, and that they could actually spend the time to understand the benefit of these systems, just like Joschka was just saying, right? The time savings that okay, you do it here, but then you see the benefits up here. They were able to spend more time understanding that and seeing it. So the evidence for them was there that these kinds of systems would help. These kinds of change processes would help. And we also found that there was a barrier, which was people working from home couldn't get access to these systems because they were on-prem. And so part of the digital transformation isn't only the data, it's where those systems are held and where those systems are accessible from, and to. So, you know, you guys know all about cloud and cloud infrastructure. We're not talking about these systems all being on, you know, AWS and available to the public. Obviously, you know, there is a migration of a lot of these systems to a cloud infrastructure, but there were a lot of potential important data that were on instruments or in instrument data software that wasn't available and couldn't be made available without the good old-fashioned put the USB key in and copy it. Obviously there's other ways of doing it, but you know, just to make a point, it was kind of like, we got so far, but then we fall down with getting access to the data. And so what were small kind of little gaps in people's digital strategy and business continuity and resilience. So these are big IT problems, right? So these were little things. No, we'll get to there. No worries. You know, we'll get there in the end. These are only small. These systems, we don't need to. Instantly became not these little cracks, massive chasms, massive gaps in their business continuity and their ability to do their business. And so, what you're seeing now, I think, is the filling of those gaps and people's final realization that when these things happen, and it could happen again, it's really sharpened everybody's mind to say we really do need to invest in this digital transformation, but also in the data systems, in the processes, so that we are far more resilient than we were beforehand. So there's some been some good things come out of it, obviously notwithstanding all the personal tragedy that many people have had, but I think it has really given the impetus for the vertical to change.
Yeah, I think that's a lesson that happens quite often, is that we see, right, is that sort of massive disruptions in how we do things then trigger, sort of disruptions in how they'll be done going forward. So on that note, if we think about that, is it possible to design for tech transfer from the start? When you begin your life cycle of product development, and you're in early process development, and then moving into the later stages, what can people be doing early on so that that's also sort of streamlining tech transfer when you get to that point in time?
I think I'm a dreamer, Yash. So I believe, yes, we can design for this. We have to design our entire process to support what is in that McKinsey report, the biggest single part, the biggest single time that we're wasting, is those 10 months. Can we squash that down to be as short as some of the other terms? And it does take a huge amount of change management, people change. I think the technologies are there, the understanding of the benefits is there, the how to do it is there, but making people understand that what they do is part of this process, and managing that process and ensuring that process is then always delivering the information that is required to support the tech transfer. So that tech transfer, in my dream, tech transfer would become a misnomer, in that you aren't actually transferring. It is just a continuum of moving there. And I think you guys are, really that tool and the infrastructure and the belief that can happen. But getting the guys right down in early development to understand what they're doing is actually important for tech transfer, not just the first element of a drug discovery and, hey, didn't we do a great job? Making sure they capture the data, that it's marked up in the same way that we're using these ontologies. The ontology needs to develop. So we've got this continual learning process that needs to go on as well, right? It's never going to be finished. It's never going to be absolutely 100% perfect. So, working in that slightly uneasy, chaotic state is something that most scientists don't like. I would never like it as a scientist.
No, that's absolutely true. And so, we think that this all has to start with, as we sort of showed in the slide, moving away from sort of this idea that documents are databases, right? Documents are sort of the worst databases because there's very little structure. They're not easily addressable. If you think about the concepts around fair data, right? Findable, addressable, interoperable, and reusable, the documents sort of violate almost every aspect of that thought process, right? So it has to start with structuring the information. And it's interesting because people in the industry are used to structuring information. They structure it in ERPs, they structure it in MESs, right? They structure it in LIMS and other analytic solutions. And but I think there needs to be this one more step of understanding that
something to piece it all together.
At a contextual level, that information needs to be structured as well, because ultimately that serves as the foundation for the context around all these other systems and their contents, if you will. And it ultimately starts to drive, once you have the structure, that's the power of the change, right? And at that point, these other things are essentially inherent benefits, right? If information is structured in a way that you can then automatically produce a table where you can do gap assessments or risk assessments, or it's structured in a way that you can get a historical understanding of the trajectory of what that particular piece of information went through to get to where it is today. I think these are all just the inherent benefits of structuring the information. And and you know, people structure it in Excel and other things as well, but ultimately that's limited. It's a two-dimensional representation of information and can't really do much more beyond that. So you know, as we continue the discussion, Joschka, you know, how can digital solutions be deployed to shorten timelines for tech transfer? You know, you've worked in, you know, as you've worked in the industry, you've seen, you know, different solutions, and, you know, what are the key elements of those solutions that ultimately get traction and can be a benefit to the industry going forward?
Yeah, so it's I think a very good question, and it all comes down to that, right? And if I had the perfect answer, maybe I would be the consultant here today, right? But I think it's all comes down to change management, right? So whatever solutions you're gonna use or you want to use, you need to sell the solution to the entire company, right? Not only to one level, maybe not only to the manager, but everyone needs to understand what's in for them, right? So the manager needs to understand that it's good for digital transformation, right down to the SME that can get information easier. Maybe we described it now in detail. So generate a report more quickly, or access data more efficiently, right? Get information faster. So, and on top of that is also very important to figure out a way how to use the new software solution, right? I mentioned that earlier, that you might want to think about the best operation mode for your solution, and you don't want to train the entire company for a new tool that you're using, and then figure out a way how to use that in conjunction with what you already have, right? So you will have Excel at the beginning, right? You want to get away from that, but there will be a transition time, and this transition time will be long because people will not change their behavior the next day, right? So you also need to think about how to, like, step by step introduce the new solution and get people away from their old habits. So I think this is the key. If you succeed in doing that, you have done it, right? So,
yeah, I mean, I think that anytime a solution is tried, people try to enforce it from a top-down approach, it generally doesn't, work that well. So there's sort of, we agree with you wholeheartedly and see that, a lot of times sort of the sandwich approach, where you have conversations with the folks at the top, but also there's a group of people or a set of people who are interested in starting to deploy that solution early on, and then that actual early implementation as a pilot tends to proliferate. The value of those that's sort of recognized as you work with your own information within any system, I think can be a real value, and then starts to inform sort of the rest of the organization as to the overall business case and the benefits around that. Paul, one of the things that we often see as people start to deploy, not just our solution, but other solutions like this, is that they recognize that then the software tends to highlight that there are gaps in their business processes, right? And so then they think about, okay, how do we refine our business processes to actually work with this solution, because it provides a significant amount of value. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your experiences around that, and how that goes hand in hand with ensuring that the solution is ultimately successful in terms of being embedded with the organization?
Yeah, good. And one thing I think Joschka made the point that first thing is never underestimate the change management mountain that you're gonna and the journey that you're gonna need to go on. That is a massive part of this. But if we look at the processes that we recommend people go through, is first of all, you have to understand where you are. What is it that you have in place at this time? Because without that, you cannot plot your journey to get to the future state. and often people focus on the future state and say the world is going to be great, the world is going to be wonderful, you know, look at this, we're going to have all these things, and then the project goes on, and then well, why didn't we get there? Well, actually, you know, from where we are to where we get to, we have to plan that journey, and that journey is not one giant leap for mankind, right? It is a number of small steps that take us on that journey. And so fundamentally you have to understand where you are, this as is state. And the as is state is not just what is our process. You know, those are very important things. And Joschka mentioned something right at the beginning where you have different sites doing the same thing differently. They have different processes, right? So first of all, there's okay, where are all these patterns? Where are all these things that are different? What are our processes in each of these environments? So once we have that, then we have to also map what applications support those processes. So we have this kind of landscape of what's going on. And then another level that is really important is what are the data? What's the data landscape that is being used and consumed during those processes? Because what we have to end up with is this kind of breadcrumb trail that says, okay, I'm here, I have my variable here that is really important for tech transfer, but that has a breadcrumb trail of coming all the way back through a number of phases, right, to this piece of data. So understanding that data landscape, and often we as scientists, we think about the data that I need to do my bit of the work, but actually that breadcrumb trail tells me that I need to capture a couple of maybe other things, or just tag this data properly, and you know, it's there, but it's just not available because it's in an Excel document or it's in a Word report, or I've mentioned it in something, right? So we need to understand this data landscape. And if you have those three layers, data, the applications, and then the process, then you can say that's where we are. Then we say, where do we want to be? Now we can map all of this into our to be state and say, this is how we want to work. And then you can find all of the gaps. You can find where some of those things are already working. And the other thing on that journey and getting ready for this is making sure that you treat it as a journey, and that these are iterations. It's not a big bang, right? You cannot jump all the way over. It's very dangerous to do that, fraught with risk, very rarely works. Everyone gets upset and the project gets deemed a failure, and actually it's just because you're trying to do too much. So this iterative, look at the benefits. Where do you want to be? That to be state, which ones are going to, which changes are going to give you the most value in the shortest period of time, and then iterate as you go through. And then coming back and mapping through to your systems, mapping through to your processes, mapping through to your data, so that you've got this view of everything that's going on. Then you're ready, and then you can start to iterate. But then you need to keep the ownership and keep that momentum going. So the projects shouldn't be, you know, short-term projects, and you need owners for this, and you need buy-in from many stakeholders that continues over a long period of time. That's kind of our experience of doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, and what we've also seen is that the companies that and the organizations that do best with this change management, especially as it pertains to sort of digital transformation, they start with a front end study to basically do exactly what you're saying, is where are we today, right? And where are our gaps? And, you know, given where we want to be in 1, 2, 3 years, and what's the ultimate objective of this digital transformation? And those who start that way then get, I think, a really good understanding of, you know, what are all the different pieces they need to put together to ultimately reach that objective, right? So if you think about that, then you know, what has been your experience in terms of how the most successful organizations structure themselves to best deploy, you know, these digital technologies to ultimately improve operational efficiency?
So I think the structures are all different, because every organization that we work with is structured slightly different. But I think there are a handful of rules that I would say the PDG rule for doing these kind of thing would be, you've got to have the right stakeholders engaged in the process. You can't leave one part of the business out or allow one part of the business to have a louder voice. So that stakeholder group and the stakeholder management and the engagement is really, really critical. Then from a project perspective, very good project teams that are able to bridge the gap between the data, and we'll mention the word data science, but the kind of wrangling of all this stuff and that endpoint, being able to bridge that with the IT infrastructure. You talked about MES and LIMS and all of these analytics platforms and the instrument data, someone that, you could have that then into the science, so that you're making sure that you're not breaking the science or making the scientists feel hamstrung or kind of handcuffed to not do what they want to do. So you've got to have that within that project team. And then more often than not, we see a gap at the moment with organizations knowing, they talk about data management, but in terms of that semantic and the ontological, the taxonomical development, we're seeing a real gap there with people actually understanding what it takes to develop. Even if you go for a taxonomy, even if you develop a taxonomy, the governance and the maintenance of that taxonomy, because it's not a single point in time, it has to evolve. And that whole process needs to be managed, because that's actually the foundations of everything that we're looking at, right? Is how do we map that? Being able to keep that engaged, operational. And if it's a semantic ontology, many people don't know what a semantic ontology is, because one of the powers of getting all of your data into your graph is not just doing your reporting. Now you have an asset of data that describes all of the processes that you've gone through over the last 20 years, or when we get there. So you can start to look at analytics on a different level, and digital concept of digital twin, and oh, well, I need a process that helps me develop this drug entity. What have we done before? Well, what's the ones that have worked before? That's so you throw the ball even further up, the semantics. And so people don't know what semantic ontologies look like, what they need to look like, so that they're consumable and of value. So there's some real kind of core pieces that good project program management, ownership, engagement, which is change management, right? But then there's some of these other technical aspects that need to be filled. So there's some gaps there currently.
Yeah, and one of the other things that often isn't addressed is that gathering all this information, building these types of systems really helps with the current work you're doing. But like you mentioned, there's an asset which is now leverageable to set a new baseline for your sort of level of information going forward for either similar programs, or if you have a platform technology or so forth, right? So now there's a whole other level of efficiencies that start to come with this digital structure as well. Well, thank you all. That was a great set of conversations. We have some questions from our audience, and so this is an interesting one. I'll start with this one, and I'll pose it to you first, Joschka, and then Paul, you can comment as well. But it's an interesting one. The question is, from your overview, where is the industry in this transformation to digital today? And who do you see as the leaders in this? And is there a risk that if the laggards do not transform, they will be lost, not functional as a business? If so, in what time frame? So I'll start with you, Joschka, on that one.
So I don't know about all of the aspects of this question, but I can talk to what we are doing basically. So Paul described it very well, right? So in the end, it's different levels that you need to think about. It's applications, it's the foundation, and it's the process, right? So, and I mean, we've been developing a taxonomy over the last years, and as Paul mentioned, this is a living thing, right? You need to work on that, and you need people to maintain it and update it. And yeah, also aligned to, I saw it on the chat a couple of times, also ICH and ISO guidelines. and they're out there and you can use them. And of course, yeah, what has been defined, you should already use, right? So this is definitely something I can say here. It makes your life easier also in discussions internally. So like finding and agreeing to terms is also a challenge. But coming back to the question, so then the next thing is, of course, the applications. You need to identify the right applications that will fulfill all your requirements along the line, right? Paul also was piling on that. You need to start early on to collect data. And that's also something we've been thinking about, like where do we start? In which systems can we capture the information already early on, so that, and then how do we transition that throughout several solutions that we're using most efficiently, right? So this is something that's for me the current state. We're now in the phase where we are have proof of concepts for all the solutions. Some solutions are up and running, and now it's the connection phase, right, where we are using APIs to push the data through and this kind of stuff, right? So this is the current state, and I know there's companies that are more ahead, right? And there's definitely companies that are behind, and I think, of course, doing this is a lot of effort, and it costs a lot of money. So I think for each company, they have to decide basically if they want to have that and if it's really beneficial for them on the long run to start enabling a company to have historical data analysis or something like that, like Paul was mentioning as well, or not, right? So this is definitely a business decision, and I mean, they will not be left behind, but everything they're doing will be slower and maybe more expensive in the future, right? And you're gonna eventually also miss certain things if you don't have this historical knowledge that you can leverage, right?
I imagine that you know, at Bayer, the organization really didn't think it was an option to not go down this route, right?
Yep.
And you know, I think you have some specific departments that are specifically, their task is, you know, the digital aspect of your operations. How are these organizations, how are these sort of groups within your organization being utilized to as part of this overall, you know, change management function that's happening at Bayer?
Yeah, so we have a digitalization and data science group where I was also working for the last year. So this is the, let's say, the central group that is planning how to set everything up. As Paul described, it's pretty similar, like what's the now state, where do we want to be, right? And then what solutions can help us to get there, and then step by step implement these. So there we have data scientists and project managers, me being one of the project managers, to get there, right? So this is one aspect. And then we have, of course, a corporate IT that takes care of certain aspects, like, I don't know, more the IT parts, right? Like, I don't know, creating APIs or databases or AWS services, this kind of stuff, right? So this is a little with the corporate level of Bayer, right? I mean, I'm talking for the biotech department. So.
Right. So, Paul, I know you're a big, you know, into sports and a sports fan. So, if you were to pick a particular sport, you know, whether it's baseball or rugby or soccer, so where in the length of the match are we in terms of our digital transformation as an industry?
Oh, we're definitely in the first half, yeah, sure. Well, with hockey, so I'm a field hockey fan. I don't, you know, not the ice hockey, slippy slidey stuff that you guys play in Canada and the US and various other places. So field hockey, we play quarters. So we're still in the first quarter, very early on. You know, I think the impetus to change is well accepted. I think the complexity and the time that it will take to get us there is perhaps not so well understood by most. Most think, oh, you know, we just throw enough money at it, we can get this problem to go away in a couple of years. You know, this isn't one of those things. This is transformation and transformational change that we're looking at here. And like Joschka said, I think for people like Bayer, the big guys, the cost is actually magnified with the historical infrastructure that they already have. You know, where you see some of the speedy little guys, the biotechs coming through, where they don't have the legacy infrastructure, they don't have the legacy systems, and actually they can put in place these systems and build from the ground up as they go. Actually, it's easier for them because the change is, okay, well, we don't have anything at the moment, so we'll change into something, as opposed to we have all of this infrastructure, we need to change it, because and everyone looks at it, well, what's the cost of that? What's the cost of, oh, there's a cost of change, all these things, you know, people start to think differently. So I think, yeah, first quarter, and also we see different organizations that are along their journeys, or they've got further along their journeys, or actually what we see is parts of the businesses are further along that digital maturity, you know, where they've gone from paper, then they've gone to electronic, they've gone partially digital, they've gone fully digital R&D, then they go to fully digital, you know, product development, and that kind of maturity in that journey. Even some groups are further ahead than others in one company, and so again, you have to sometimes see that one group has gone up and they've gone, okay, we're going to build a new lab, we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a new lab, a new infrastructure, you know, new manufacturing sites, and we're going to put all of this infrastructure in. But very few organizations can afford that, and so you know, so they'll do one bit, but then the other pieces have to catch up, because to your point, Yash and Joschka, we're talking about tech transfer, where data from other labs and further down back in the process is required, and they may not have had the money spent. So, you know, there's a whole heap of stuff to get through and change to go through. But I think the good thing is, with, you know, you mentioned FAIR as well, Yash, right? FAIR as a principle, it's not new, it's not rocket science. All that's happened in my mind is that it's been made aware that there is this thing. Well, we've always had master data management problems. You know, we've never been tagging our data very well. We haven't been structuring it very well. So, you know, putting a lens on that and saying, here's a process that you can go through and a way to measure it, because not all data is born fair, not all data needs to be fair. But those pieces that we need for tech transfer, absolutely, we need full fair kind of approach to it. So yeah, first quarter, early start, good start, and maybe 2-0 at the moment, and we're feeling good, but we've got quite a bit of way to go.
Well, thank you both. You know, so we're coming to the end of our webinar. Our thanks today to today's speakers and to all of you who took the time to join us today. We will be sending a link to the recording of the video to all of those who registered, and we'll also respond to any questions that have appeared in the chat that we were not able to address in this hour. So thank you again for your time and your thoughts and your comments and your questions from the audience, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Yash. Thanks, Joschka. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.